The dust clouds rose high above the Arizona desert as Jake Morrison rode his black stallion across the endless landscape. The sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered face, and sweat dripped from under his worn cowboy hat. He had been tracking cattle rustlers for 3 days, following their trail deeper into Apache territory than any white man should venture alone. Jake was not like other cowboys. At 32 years old, he had spent most of his life on the frontier, learning to respect the land and its people rather than conquering them. His father had been killed in an Apache raid when Jake was just 15, but instead of seeking revenge, he had chosen to understand. He learned their language, their customs, and earned the respect of several Apache chiefs through fair dealings and honest words. As he crested a small hill, Jake's sharp eyes caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. In the valley below, a group of armed white men had surrounded a small Apache camp. But this was no ordinary raid. Through his spyglass, Jake could see 7 young Apache women, all sisters by their similar features and age, being roughly handled by the men. The youngest looked no more than 16, while the eldest might have been 25. The leader of the white men was a tall, thin man with a cruel smile that Jake recognized immediately. Samuel Blackwood was a notorious slave trader who had been operating along the frontier for years, always staying one step ahead of the law. Blackwood specialized in capturing young Native American women and selling them to wealthy men in distant cities who desired exotic servants or worse. Jake's jaw clenched as he watched Blackwood inspect each sister like livestock at a market. The Apache women stood with dignity, despite their fear, their dark eyes showing defiance even in the face of terror. Their traditional dresses were torn from the struggle, and rope burns marked their wrists where they had been bound. "Perfect specimens," Blackwood called out to his men, his voice carrying across the desert air. "These 7 will bring us a fortune in San Francisco. The Chinese merchants pay top dollar for Apache beauties." One of Blackwood's men, a scarred brute named Rusty, spat tobacco juice into the sand. "What about their menfolk? Won't they come looking?" Blackwood laughed coldly. "Their village was raided by the cavalry last week. These girls were gathering medicine plants when it happened. No one knows where they are, and no one is coming to save them." Jake's heart pounded as he realized the horrible truth. These sisters had survived one tragedy, only to fall into the hands of monsters who would sell them into a life of slavery and degradation. The Apache had laws about protecting their women, but these girls were completely alone and helpless. From his hiding spot behind a cluster of rocks, Jake counted Blackwood's men. There were 8 of them, all heavily armed with rifles and pistols. They had set up a temporary camp with plans to move the sisters at nightfall to avoid detection. Jake knew that once they reached the railroad depot 50 miles north, the girls would disappear forever into the criminal underground that stretched from California to New York. The eldest sister, a striking woman with intelligent eyes and proud bearing, spoke to Blackwood in perfect English. "You make a grave mistake, white man. Our people will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this crime." Blackwood backhanded her across the face, sending her stumbling backward. "Your people are scattered like leaves in the wind, girl, and even if they weren't, they'd never find where you're going." Jake had seen enough. He carefully backed his horse away from the ridge and found a sheltered spot to plan his approach. The odds were terrible, 1 man against 8, but he couldn't ride away and leave those innocent women to their fate. His conscience wouldn't allow it, and neither would his sense of honor. As the afternoon wore on, Jake studied the camp layout and the routines of the guards. Blackwood had positioned his men strategically around the small valley, but they were overconfident and relaxed. They believed themselves safe in this remote location, far from any law enforcement or Apache warriors. The sisters sat huddled together near a small fire, taking comfort in each other's presence. Jake could see them whispering prayers in their native language and drawing strength from their shared faith and family bonds. The youngest often looked to the eldest for guidance, and Jake could tell she was trying to be brave for her sister's sake. As evening approached, Blackwood's men began preparing for their journey. They brought out chains and shackles, planning to bind the sisters for the long trip to the railroad. Jake knew this was his last chance to act before they moved to a more secure location. He checked his weapons carefully: a reliable Colt revolver, a Winchester rifle, and a sharp knife that had served him well in tight situations. More importantly, he had the element of surprise and intimate knowledge of this terrain from years of riding these lands. Jake also had something else that Blackwood's men lacked: the respect and trust of the Apache people. If he could free the sisters and get them to safety, he knew where to take them. Chief Running Bear's village was only 20 miles southeast, and the chief owed Jake a debt of gratitude for helping negotiate a peaceful resolution to a water rights dispute the previous year. As darkness began to fall across the desert, Jake Morrison prepared to risk everything to save 7 innocent women from a fate worse than death. He knew the odds were against him, but he also knew he was the only hope these sisters had. The frontier was a harsh place where the strong preyed upon the weak, but Jake believed it was also a place where one good man could make a difference. He whispered a prayer to whatever gods watched over the desert, then began his careful descent toward Blackwood's camp. The real test of his courage and skill was about to begin. Jake waited until the moon was hidden behind thick clouds before making his move. The desert night was alive with the sounds of coyotes howling in the distance and the gentle whisper of wind through the sagebrush. Blackwood's men had grown comfortable in their isolated camp, posting only 2 guards while the others slept around the dying campfire. Moving like a shadow, Jake left his horse tied securely behind a rock formation and began his approach on foot. His years of living on the frontier had taught him to move silently across any terrain, and the soft desert sand muffled his footsteps perfectly. He carried his knife in his right hand and moved with the patience of a hunting cat. The first guard, a young man named Pete, was supposed to be watching the northern approach to the camp. Instead, he was half asleep against a boulder, his rifle resting carelessly across his lap. Jake appeared behind him like a ghost, covering the guard's mouth with one hand while pressing the knife to his throat with the other. "Make one sound and you die," Jake whispered in the man's ear. "Nod if you understand." Pete's eyes went wide with terror, but he nodded frantically. Jake quickly bound and gagged him with strips torn from the man's own shirt, then dragged him into the shadows where he wouldn't be found until morning. The second guard was more alert, pacing back and forth near the horses. Jake knew he couldn't approach this one directly without being seen. Instead, he picked up a small rock and threw it into the brush on the far side of the camp. When the guard went to investigate the noise, Jake moved in swiftly and silently took him down in the same manner as the first. Now came the dangerous part. The 7 sisters were sleeping near the center of the camp, surrounded by the remaining 6 members of Blackwood's gang. Jake needed to wake the women without alerting their captors, then create enough confusion to allow them all to escape. He crept to where the eldest sister lay and gently touched her shoulder. Her eyes opened immediately, alert and wary. When she saw Jake's face in the starlight, her expression changed from fear to hope. He had visited Chief Running Bear's village many times, and she recognized him as the white man who spoke their language and treated their people with respect. "Friend," she whispered in Apache. Jake nodded and held up 7 fingers, then pointed to each of her sleeping sisters. She understood immediately and began quietly waking them one by one. The sisters were experienced in moving silently, a skill necessary for survival in Apache culture, and they gathered their courage as they realized rescue was at hand. But their hope was short-lived. As the youngest sister stood up, she accidentally kicked a tin cup that had been left beside her sleeping spot. The metallic clang echoed through the quiet night like a gunshot. "What was that?" Blackwood's voice cut through the darkness as he sat up in his bedroll. "Pete, check on the prisoners!" When no response came, Blackwood knew something was wrong. He reached for his gun and shouted to wake his sleeping men. "We're under attack! Everyone up!" Jake realized stealth was no longer possible. He jumped to his feet and fired his rifle into the air while shouting in Apache for the sisters to run. The camp erupted into chaos as Blackwood's men scrambled for their weapons in the darkness. "The horses!" Jake yelled to the eldest sister. "Get your sisters to the horses!" But Blackwood was faster than Jake had anticipated. The slave trader fired his pistol, and the bullet caught Jake in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. Pain shot through his arm, but he drew his Colt revolver with his right hand and returned fire. The desert night exploded with gunfire and shouts. Blackwood's men were shooting wildly in the darkness, trying to hit targets they couldn't clearly see. The seven sisters ran toward the horses as Jake had instructed, but two of Blackwood's men cut them off. "Grab the girls!" Blackwood screamed over the gunfire. "Don't let them escape!" Jake saw one of the men reaching for the youngest sister and knew he had to act. Ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder, he charged across the camp and tackled the man to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, fighting desperately for control of the man's gun. Meanwhile, the eldest sister had reached the horses. She was an excellent rider, as were all her sisters, and she quickly untied several animals. "Sister, help friend!" she called out in broken English, pointing toward Jake's struggle. The other sisters understood. While four of them mounted horses and prepared to flee, the other two ran to help Jake. One sister picked up a heavy stick from the firewood pile and struck Jake's opponent across the head, knocking him unconscious. "Go!" Jake shouted, blood streaming down his arm. "I'll hold them off!" But the eldest sister shook her head firmly. In perfect English, she said, "You risk your life for us. We do not abandon friends." More gunshots rang out as Blackwood and his remaining men closed in. Jake knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, but the Apache sisters had a plan of their own. Growing up in the harsh desert had taught them to be resourceful and brave in dangerous situations. The second sister had found Jake's dropped rifle and threw it to him. Despite his wounded shoulder, Jake caught it and immediately took cover behind a large rock. The eldest sister whistled sharply, a signal used by Apache scouts, and suddenly the night came alive with an eerie sound. The sisters began making the war cries of their people, their voices echoing off the surrounding canyon walls and creating the illusion of a much larger attacking force. The sound was terrifying in the darkness, designed to strike fear into the hearts of enemies who couldn't see how many warriors they faced. Blackwood's men began to panic. They had heard stories of Apache war parties and their legendary ability to appear out of nowhere like ghosts. In the darkness and confusion, they couldn't tell if they were fighting one cowboy and 7 women, or if they had stumbled into a trap set by dozens of Apache warriors. "It's an Apache ambush!" one of the men screamed. "We're surrounded!" Even Blackwood began to doubt himself. The war cries seemed to come from every direction, and the darkness made it impossible to see their true enemies. When another of his men fell to Jake's accurate shooting, the slave trader made a decision that would save his own life, but doom his evil plans. "Retreat!" Blackwood shouted. "Fall back to the horses!" But the sisters had already scattered most of the horses, and Blackwood's men found themselves on foot in hostile territory. Jake kept up a steady rate of fire, making them believe they were facing multiple attackers, while the 7 sisters continued their war cries from different positions around the camp. As dawn began to break over the desert horizon, Blackwood and his surviving men finally managed to escape on the few horses they could catch. They rode north toward the railroad, defeated and empty-handed, leaving behind their weapons and supplies in their desperate flight. Jake slumped against the rock where he had taken cover, exhaustion and blood loss finally taking their toll. The eldest sister appeared beside him, tearing strips from her dress to bandage his wounded shoulder. "You saved us," she said softly. "But why? We are not your people." Jake looked into her intelligent eyes and saw the same humanity he recognized in every person, regardless of their race or culture. "Because it was the right thing to do," he replied simply. "Because every person deserves to be free." As the sun rose fully over the Arizona desert, the 7 Apache sisters and their unlikely cowboy hero prepared for the final leg of their journey to safety. But their ordeal was far from over, and the true scope of Blackwood's evil scheme had yet to be revealed. The journey to Chief Running Bear's village took 2 days, with Jake's wounded shoulder making travel slow and difficult. The 7 sisters proved to be skilled in desert medicine, using traditional Apache remedies to treat his injury and prevent infection. They traveled carefully, avoiding main trails and keeping watch for any sign of Blackwood's return. On the second evening, as they made camp near a hidden spring, the eldest sister finally told Jake her name. "I am called Morning Star," she said, tending to his bandaged shoulder. "My sisters are Dawn Light, Summer Rain, Quiet Moon, Dancing Wind, Gentle Stream, and Little Fox." She pointed to each sister in turn, and Jake committed their names to memory with the respect their courage deserved. "Why did Blackwood say no one would look for you?" Jake asked as they shared dried meat and water from the spring. Morning Star's expression darkened. "Our village was attacked by soldiers, but not in the way that man believes. It was planned. Someone told the cavalry exactly when our warriors would be away hunting and where to find our families." This revelation hit Jake like a thunderbolt. "You mean someone set up your people?" "Yes," Summer Rain, the second eldest, spoke up. "The attack was too perfect, too well planned. The soldiers knew exactly where to strike to cause the most damage while taking the fewest casualties themselves." Jake's mind raced as the pieces began falling into place. Blackwood's operation isn't just random slave-taking. He's working with someone inside the government, someone who can provide information about Apache movements and ensure that cavalry raids eliminate potential rescuers. Dancing Wind, one of the middle sisters, nodded grimly. "We heard the soldiers talking during the attack. They mentioned reporting back to someone called Colonel Phoenix about completing their mission." Jake had never heard of any Colonel Phoenix in the Territorial Military Command, which meant this person was either operating in secret or using a false identity. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer and more disturbing. When they finally reached Chief Running Bear's village, they were greeted with joy and amazement. The chief had assumed all 7 sisters were dead, and their return was seen as a miracle. But the celebration was tempered by Jake's disturbing news about the conspiracy behind the cavalry attack. Chief Running Bear was a wise leader in his 60s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much violence between his people and the white settlers. He listened carefully to Jake's theory about the organized nature of Blackwood's operation. "This explains much," the chief said thoughtfully. "There have been other incidents across our territory. Young women disappearing after convenient cavalry raids, always targeting villages when the warriors are away. We thought it was just the Army's improved intelligence gathering." Jake spent 3 days recovering in the village, while the sisters reunited with surviving relatives who had fled to other Apache camps after the attack. During this time, he gathered more information about the pattern of raids and disappearances. The evidence was overwhelming. Someone was systematically targeting Apache villages to provide a steady supply of captives for Blackwood's slave trade. But Jake knew that exposing this conspiracy would require proof that white authorities would accept. Apache testimony alone would never be believed in a territorial court, especially against military officers. He needed to catch Blackwood and his government contact in the act. Morning Star approached him on his final evening in the village. "You plan to pursue this matter further," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have to," Jake replied. "If I don't stop them, they'll keep destroying Apache families and selling innocent women into slavery." "Then we will help you," Morning Star declared. "This white devil and his friends killed our father and mother and destroyed our home. We have the right to see justice done." Jake started to protest, knowing the danger involved, but Morningstar cut him off. "Do not insult us by suggesting we are helpless. We are Apache women. We know how to fight, how to track, and how to survive. You cannot do this alone." After much discussion, they developed a plan. Jake would return to the nearest town, Copper Creek, and begin investigating the connection between the cavalry raids and Blackwood's operation. Meanwhile, the sisters would use their knowledge of Apache territory to track down other kidnapping victims and gather evidence of the broader conspiracy. The plan required Jake to pose as a bounty hunter interested in capturing escaped Apache prisoners for the reward money. This would give him an excuse to ask questions about recent raids and military operations while appearing to support the very system he was trying to expose. Copper Creek was a rough frontier town that served as a supply depot for military patrols and mining operations. The saloons were full of soldiers, scouts, and mercenaries who traded information and boasted about their exploits against the local Apache tribes. Jake spent several days listening to conversations and buying drinks for talkative soldiers. Eventually, he struck gold when he met Sergeant Billy Mason, a cavalry veteran who had participated in the raid on the sisters' village. "Strangest orders I ever got," Mason admitted after several whiskeys. "Colonel Phoenix himself came down from territorial headquarters with specific instructions about timing and targets. Said we had intelligence that the village was harboring stolen army supplies." "Did you find any stolen supplies?" Jake asked casually. Mason shook his head. "Nothing but families and old people. Made me sick, to tell the truth. But orders are orders, and Phoenix said it was a matter of territorial security." Jake bought Mason another drink and probed for more details. "This Colonel Phoenix sounds like he really knows his business. Does he run many operations like that?" "More than you might think," Mason replied, his tongue loosened by alcohol. "Phoenix has informants all through Apache country. Seems to know their movements better than they do themselves. Word is he's got special authorization from Washington to conduct preemptive operations against hostile tribes." But the most shocking revelation came when Mason described Colonel Phoenix himself. "Tall, thin fellow with cold eyes and a cruel smile. Dresses fancy, like he's going to a society party instead of a military briefing. Never seen him dirty or tired, even after a long patrol." Jake's blood ran cold as he realized Mason was describing Samuel Blackwood himself. The slave trader wasn't just working with someone in the military. He was the military contact, using a false identity and forged credentials to order cavalry raids that would supply his criminal enterprise. The next morning, Jake received a message from Morningstar through a network of Apache allies. The sisters had discovered something even more disturbing: a hidden camp 50 miles north of Copper Creek, where dozens of Apache women and children were being held in chains, awaiting transport to slave markets in distant cities. The message also revealed that Blackwood, still using his Colonel Phoenix identity, was planning a major raid on Chief Running Bear's village in 3 days. He believed the sisters had escaped there and wanted to recapture them while eliminating any witnesses to his operation. Jake realized he was facing a race against time. He had to expose Blackwood's conspiracy and rescue the imprisoned women before the false colonel could complete his evil scheme. But he also knew that going up against a man with military authority and a small army of corrupt soldiers would require careful planning and considerable help. As he prepared to leave Copper Creek, Jake spotted a familiar face across the street. Judge William Hartwell was stepping down from a stagecoach, accompanied by 2 federal marshals. Jake knew Hartwell by reputation, an honest judge who had fought corruption throughout his career and was known for his fair treatment of Native Americans in territorial courts. This was the break Jake had been hoping for. If he could present his evidence to Judge Hartwell and convince the federal marshals to investigate, he might be able to stop Blackwood's operation and save not just the 7 sisters, but dozens of other innocent victims. But first, he had to survive what was sure to be a final confrontation with Samuel Blackwood and his army of corrupt soldiers. The real battle for justice on the frontier was about to begin, and Jake Morrison knew that the fate of every Apache family in the territory might depend on the outcome. As he mounted his horse and rode toward the hidden slave camp, Jake thought about the courage of Morning Star and her sisters, and the trust Chief Running Bear had placed in him. He would not fail them. Whatever the cost, he would expose this merciless scheme and bring justice to the Arizona frontier.